You're listening to the Corbett Report.
Welcome, friends. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. 6th of November 2017 here on this side of the dateline. Today we're joined on the other side of the dateline by a guest that you haven't seen on the Corbett Report for a few years, but I imagine if you're watching the Corbett Report, you probably have seen her reporting in the last few years. I'm talking about Eva Bartlett, who blogs at ingaza.wordpress.com. Her reporting is widely covered by a lot of sites, Mint Press News and RT.com and others. And she has been covering the Syria story, the terrorist insurgency in Syria, like no other reporter. So it's great to have her here to talk about her experiences. Eva, thank you very much for joining us again today.
Thank you, James. It's always a pleasure.
Well, as I say, it's been a few years. It's been since 2014 that we've actually talked. And in that intervening 3 years, you've had quite a number of interesting experiences in Syria and elsewhere, of course, reporting on a number of issues. But let's give people the overall whirlwind tour of what it is you've been doing, what you've been seeing over the last few years.
Okay, thanks. I think when we last spoke, I was in the States somewhere, maybe in New Jersey. I was giving some talks on Gaza, where I lived for 3 years, and was just trying to explain to people, what Palestinians are subject to daily. Under siege and random, Israeli bombardments. But I had also been following events in Syria since the inception in 2011. And I had, trusted sources that I was in contact with, trusted sites I was reading. And I had formed a group, just a mailing list in 2012 or 13, just to discuss Syria. And it wasn't until April 2014 that I was able to go for the first time, having left Gaza and done some talks in the States. And so I went there with the peace delegation, stayed for a week, and then I stayed on a couple of weeks afterwards and started to just get a feel of, interacting with people, speaking in my broken colloquial Arabic with people, enough to get the gist of what they wanted to convey to me. And from the very beginning, people were saying, this is not a revolution. They were saying, we don't want these terrorists in our country. And many of them, to be clear, did say when things started in 2011, they thought there was going to be change. They wanted political change. They wanted an end to certain things, corruption. They wanted certain political changes. But right from the beginning, they realized, with sectarian slogans about killing Alawis and driving Christians out of Syria, that this was not the kind of political change that they had aspired for. So then I went back to Syria a number of times since then. Last summer, I spent 2 months in Syria, traveling widely in Latakia, the western coast, and also to Aleppo. And I'm sure your viewers are very well aware that last year in particular, the war propaganda around Aleppo really ramped up, from everything from hospitals being destroyed to last doctors, last clowns, toy smugglers, to Bana Alabed, a 7-year-old miraculously tweeting girl that we're told was tweeting from eastern Aleppo. And there's a lot more propaganda that we'll get into. So in July and August last year, I went to Aleppo. And then in November, I went twice more. And I was just there this past June. And of course, there's other areas that I went to because I think, in Western reporting on Syria, they either just don't report about what they call government or they say regime areas. They don't report about them at all, or they discount those of us who do go and talk to people there. And they say, well, you can't possibly be telling the truth because you're in a government area and you have minders. And, as an aside, many times I was on my own having one-on-ones with people. And they also say, well, what does it matter, what's happening in the government areas? Well, actually, you know what? There's at least 7 million internally displaced Syrians in government areas being housed and not in tents like they are in countries bordering Syria. And if you go to these areas, these government areas, as media calls them, you can talk with people from, at the time, Aleppo or Hasaka or Eastern Syria. You can get a sense of what people from across the country have endured. And I did. So that, in a nutshell, is what I've been up to.
It's a strange inversion, and I've seen this in some of your exchanges with the mainstream dinosaur media people who are challenging you on these issues. And almost in a way, they're, using your actual experience, actually talking to real Syrians against you in some way, as if this is somehow, you're just getting the propaganda from them. This isn't real information. But of course, I mean, we all know that actually being in a place like Aleppo will give a different experiences than these reporters who are relying on their sources inside Aleppo from these, Human Rights Watch and other groups that are obviously not conveying the full truth. And of course, the infamous guy in London who's running his Syrian observatory thing about, just this nonsense that's being pumped out. So let's focus a little bit more on Aleppo, Madaya, these other places that have become these flashpoints for the propaganda that we saw so heavily over the past summer about, or the year before, talking about the blockade and, it's the Syrian government blockading and starving these citizens and Russia along helping them and bombing these places. Let's talk about what you actually saw in these places that goes against that narrative.
Right. So with Aleppo, when I went in July, my first interest was, are there any doctors in Aleppo? Because while it ramped up in like October, November, these reports of last doctors and last hospitals, even in the beginning of the year and early months, people were writing about last doctors, last pediatricians. So when I went to Aleppo, I went to the Aleppo Medical Association, and they said, we've got over 4,000 registered and active doctors, including, I added it up, 800 specialists. And also, I went to a hospital, a maternity hospital that had been bombed, and 3 women had been killed. And, so with all the Western outcry about hospitals allegedly being bombed, there was almost nothing said about this Dabit maternity hospital. So that was one point I really wanted to address, is that there are doctors in Aleppo, but the media is hyping up that there's no doctors in eastern Aleppo. They never talk about, when they talk about hospitals bombed, whether a hospital was bombed. They never talk about Al-Qaeda having militarized the hospital and turned the hospital basement into a dungeon. And this is not just me saying this. Many people have gone and seen with their own eyes, but I went this past June to the Eye and Children's Hospital complex. And in the basement of at least one of the buildings I saw, and I was told many more had these prisons, was basically a basement that had been turned into large room prison cells that could hold tens of people, 40 people, for example. No windows, no mattresses, nothing, and some confinement cells. And these prisons were being used by these moderate rebels to try civilians in Sharia courts, and so basically deciding whether they lived or not. So in terms of what was happening in eastern Aleppo, the Western media narrative left out Al-Qaeda and Nuruddin al-Zinki and Ahrar al-Sham and the other moderates. In Aleppo, the corporate media wasn't reporting on the daily bombardment by these terrorist factions of civilians and the snipings by these terrorist factions of civilians and children, and that schools had been bombed. I remember sometime last year, I think it was around October, there was some big United Nations outcry about allegedly a school that had been bombed. And it might have been September. It might have been around the time when one of these, pointless ceasefires were enacted, in which the Syrians and the Russians adhered to the ceasefire and all the, proxy terrorists did not. And so there was some fake bombing, I think in Idlib, I don't remember, of a school. And the UN they said this is the worst bombing in the Syrian crisis. And they didn't remember a school, Akrami school in, I think it was Latakia, that was bombed and 40 kids were killed, and many other instances. But yeah, you mentioned starvation. So in Aleppo, for months, the theme was Assad is starving civilians in Aleppo. In January 2016, suddenly all the media was talking about Assad is starving the civilians in Madaya, which is a town northwest of Damascus. And, the media went to the extent of even using photos of people that weren't even from Madaya. One of the more notable ones was this girl, Mariana or something, 7 or 8 years old, from South Lebanon. They took her photo from social media, and her parents found out and were outraged and said, this is our girl. She came on and she said, I don't live in Aleppo, I live in South Lebanon. And other photos were taken off of the internet, and they weren't even from Syria. So this is in regards to Madaya. When I went this June, I talked with people there, and they said, no, actually, there was food that went in. And, Syria's representative to the United Nations, Dr. Bashar al-Jafri, said many times in the UN, we sent food in. And at one point, he said, we tried to send another convoy in, but the UN decided not to send it in for their own prerogative, their own reasons. So, when I was there, the civilians I was talking with said the terrorists hoarded the food and they were selling it at prices we couldn't afford. People who were in Aleppo when it was liberated and talking to people from eastern Aleppo, they were hearing the same thing and a lot worse things about the behavior of these so-called moderate rebels. Also in Madaya, I saw, a bomb factory of these terrorists. And ironically, right outside the bomb factory was a Red Cross food parcel. And above the bomb factory had been a storage of the food and medical aid that came into Madaya. So this whole theme that we're hearing now in Eastern Ghouta and that we heard in Homs, Old Homs in 2014, also a place I went to. This whole theme of the government or the Syrian army is starving the people is complete lies, because there are sieges enforced, but that doesn't mean they're not allowing food aid into the area. And if you see some of the pictures of these terrorists, some of them are quite plump, and you have to ask, if they're so starved, why are they so hefty? We know that they're getting the food. We know they're holding the food, and that's what's happening now in Eastern Ghouta. And the same kind of propaganda is being recycled.
Yeah. And there's so much of this blatant, not just propaganda, but just outright fakery involved in this Syrian conflict, including there was a couple of years ago that heroic Syrian boy saving his sister footage by the Norwegian film crew on the Gladiator set. I mean, it was just total nonsense. And one prime example of that everyone, and I mean everyone, will know, even if they don't follow what's happening in Syria, is the story of Omran Daqneesh, who people probably don't know by name, but definitely know the photo of him sitting in the back of the ambulance, the iconic photo, and we had the CNN anchors crying over it, and Christian Amanpour grading Bashar al-Assad about this. Oh, you did this, sir, and all this kind of nonsense. But none of those heroic, intrepid reporters bothered to actually track down Omran or his family or talk to them about that incident, except for yours truly, Eva Bartlett. Thank you very much for doing that. Tell us about Omran's story. Just refresh us on that story for those who don't remember, and then tell us what the real story was.
So Omran and his family were living in an area of eastern Aleppo, and I believe it was August 2016. Overnight, suddenly all the main corporate media and certain human rights groups were showing his face. And you mentioned it was a cute little angelic face, kind of a bowl haircut, sitting in an ambulance, a little bit of blood on his face. He looked very surprised. Nobody was giving him any medical attention. But we were meant to believe that this boy was injured, and perhaps seriously injured, by either a Syrian or Russian airstrike. When I talked to his father, Mohammed Daqneesh, he said, first of all, he never heard an airstrike, and it was not an airstrike. And second of all, that his boy was only mildly injured. And he said, we have mild injuries, but it's most likely from rubble. It's a rubble falling. There was some sort of blast, but it was not an airstrike. And moreover, when Mohammed Daqneesh was collecting his remaining, family members, his kids and his wife, and putting them in a safe room in the apartment, the white helmet snatched Omran from him and stuck him in this ambulance and did their photo op, and then took him away to one of the terrorist-occupied hospitals. The father came out of the building, said, "Where's my son?" And he was told by somebody that he was taken to this hospital, and he went there immediately because he didn't trust the people at the hospital who were terrorists, took his boy home, and, he maintains that afterwards he was coerced by, bribery and threats to go with the narrative that the terrorists were putting forth, that it was a Syrian or Russian airstrike. He's living in Aleppo. Look, when you talk to a person, you can tell if they have a gun to their head and if they're being forced in what they're saying. He was speaking naturally. His family looks healthy. He's back to his normal life, as are the other people that were being essentially held hostage in eastern Aleppo. So he's disgusted by what the media did, including like the CNN actress, crying for Omran. And I asked him, did you know who the photographer of your boy was? And he said yes. I think what was the guy's nickname? Sheikh or something, but his name is Mahmoud Raslan. And I had come across an interview in, I think, The Independent or some other British paper, in which Raslan said he cried for children like Omran. He just felt so sad. Well, for people who don't know who Mahmoud Raslan is, he was filmed, he took a selfie with the child beheaders of the Nur ad-Din al-Zinki faction, which also in 2016, before Omran's mild injury, this faction, Nur ad-Din al-Zinki, beheaded a Palestinian boy and bragged about it and filmed it. It's all online. It's all on YouTube. There's photos of them. And the photographer, Mahmoud Raslan, who cares so much about children, took a grinning selfie with these murderers. So
child beheaders, literal child beheaders. You cannot make this up. It is so outrageous. It is so disgusting. And I did make a video about that at the time. And it's just, it boggles the imagination that this level of in your face, outright lying and fakery can be thrust out there. And I guarantee 99% of the population that, again, it doesn't even follow what's happening in Syria will know this photo and will get the gist of it. Oh, look at what Assad has done. So, again, just to reiterate for people, his father does not blame Assad for what happened, does he?
No, he does not. He blames the terrorist factions. And, it's quite likely that one of these factions fired some sort of explosive device at the building. I mean, there was some sort of explosion, but it was not an airstrike. But, in terms of other blatant lies, The Guardian, so in, I believe it was April 2016, all the media were reporting that a hospital in al-Sukri, Aleppo, named the Quds Hospital, was destroyed. And Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, was the kind of the origin of that claim, because they said it had been reduced to rubble, because they were told by their Al-Qaeda counterparts on the ground it had been hit by an airstrike and reduced to rubble. So MSF stood behind this claim, and then, of course, all the media regurgitated it. And The Guardian did, of course, as well. And then, so some months later, bearing in mind that this was reduced to rubble, The Guardian was then reporting that a hospital in al-Sukri, which is only the Al-Quds Hospital, was treating victims of chlorine gas attacks, saying that the Syrian army had used chlorine gas, this whole chemical weapons lie that's used over and over again. And so they're saying that this hospital, which they claimed months earlier was destroyed, is now treating victims of chlorine. And they didn't look into the fact that the only chlorine factory in Syria was taken over by al-Nusra in August or something, 2012. And that it's against the interest of the Syrian government to use chemical weapons when conventional bombs are far more effective.
Yes, of course. And with the chemical weapons attack earlier this year, the sarin attack, of course. I mean, yeah, why wouldn't Assad, on the brink of total victory in Syria, why wouldn't he, use chemical weapons against his own people? That just makes total sense. And if you read the New York Times trying to justify why they said he would do this, it was just to show his power and to show that he could get away with it. Just total nonsense. Again, on every level, total propaganda, total nonsense. This is total information warfare against the American people and whoever else is listening in the English language at the very least, just to convince them that there's some sort of valid reason for what's going on there. Speaking of children being used by their families for propaganda purposes, let's talk about Bana Alabed. Who on earth is this valiant 7-year-old, 8-year-old, whatever she is now, at Alabed Bana on Twitter? Who is she? What's her story?
Well, I can't quote directly from her tweets because I'm blocked, but by a 7-year-old. Well, she's now 8-year-old. But at the time when she opened her Twitter in late-ish, like September or so, 2016, she was a 7-year-old girl living in eastern Aleppo, and she started tweeting how she wanted peace and how, Assad was bombing Aleppo. She tweeted something about Holocaust Aleppo and we need World War III. She was presented to us as this child that was suffering in war and was tweeting about her life in amazingly good English for a 7-year-old girl, even if she was a native English speaker, I have to say. And so after some time, like a month or two, her followers on Twitter skyrocketed to hundreds of thousands. And by the time that Aleppo was being liberated, she was tweeting along with other social media activists. This may be my last tweet. I don't know if I'll make it out alive. There was actually a Syrian journalist, Maitham al-Askar, I think his last name is, and I believe it was him. He was trying to get in touch with the family to say, look, we will guarantee you safe evacuation. I can't remember much more to his investigation, but he basically deduced they were there in eastern Aleppo, but they refused to be via him or by his contacts safely evacuated. But in the end, anyway, when terrorist factions were taken from eastern Aleppo and given safe military escort and passage to Idlib. So that's another point, is the Syrian government honored its promise, and the Russians, to allow these terrorists, Al-Qaeda, to leave Aleppo and go to Idlib, and then they went on, most of them, to Turkey. Bana's family went with them. And Bana ended up in Turkey, met Erdogan, took a nice photo with Erdogan, got Turkish citizenship. And while she was there, she was interviewed by a South African man, maybe with the Young Turks, Don't quote me on that, but definitely a South African man who said, "Now, Bana, you might not understand my English, so I will speak slowly, and you have, your mother and someone else to help you." And his first question to loosen her up was, "Do you like the food in Istanbul?" And she said, "Guess what? Save the children of Syria," which is a pretty strange answer.
One more time, sorry.
Save the children of Syria. To "Do you like the food in Istanbul?" Then the guy followed up and he said, "Bana, do you like Istanbul?" And in the meantime, her mother said in Arabic, "What do you like to eat, Bana?" So she said to the question, "Do you like Istanbul?" She said, "Fish." So this is a child we're meant to believe.
But we saw her on CNN, Eva. We saw her speaking so naturally and not at all reading things that were not at all on a teleprompter in front of her. It was a natural conversation, honest.
Right. And when she gave one of her natural video pleas to the world, and she walked up in Aleppo and she said, "I'm so sad, it's so bad." She was literally standing meters from the main Al-Qaeda headquarters either in northern Syria, certainly in Aleppo. And for a fact that Al-Qaeda isn't going to let just anybody film and take photos. And the journalist that found this out, we have to commend Khalid Iskif. He's a journalist from Aleppo, and he's dug into all of this. He found out that Bana's daddy, Ghassan, was a terrorist in the Al-Safwa brigades. He was a military trainer. He has a legal background, which is what he proclaims on Twitter. He's a lawyer and for peace and I don't know what. But he was working in one of these Sharia courts and deciding whether people die or not. And he was at one point working with, Al-Qaeda. And Bana's whole area was surrounded by Al-Qaeda headquarters. So it's not conceivable to believe, especially given that the father's own notebook said that he worked as a military trainer and as, in the Sharia courts. It's not conceivable that this family was not deeply embedded with terrorists. And so now Bana has come out with memoirs. Her English since, she said fish has improved, and she's written the memoirs. She was paraded around the UN. Different UN diplomats retweeted her emotional speech about children and education. And, the irony is that the schools in her area were occupied by terrorists, and they were firing on children in greater Aleppo.
And to put it all in perspective, if the terrorists have their way, of course, Bana and other girls would not be in the schools at all. So there you go.
And as soon as the terrorists left East Aleppo and people started coming back and cleaning up, schools reopened. And these children that hadn't been able to go to school were going back to school.
It just, as I say, the propaganda is just so incredibly in your face, so blatant. It is really disgusting when you start peeling back the layers. So on that note, you did mention some journalists there that have been doing some of this work. Who do you recommend what sources do you recommend people to be going to if they want actual information coming out of places like Syria?
Well, I'm going to be recommending some Russian propagandists.
Don't worry, I'm on the list too, so.
Basically, Russian propagandist is anybody that does some research or dares to even go there. I like to recommend Syrians. So, for more war report type things, there's a guy named Muhammad Ali who reports for Press TV. He's done some incredibly brave reporting, and he's been in these places like Al-Wa'ar Homs that was occupied by terrorists. He's been on front lines. Khalid Iskif, but he's mainly in Arabic. I look at 21st Century Wire, Global Research, of course. I do look at Russia Today, and I contribute to Russia Today, but it's my own opinion. Vanessa Beeley is a colleague of mine, and she's done a lot of tremendous on-the-ground research and interviewing with people, especially she was there in Aleppo as it was being liberated. And she's also followed the story of Bana Alabed. But there are many excellent, the Duran, New Eastern Outlook. I look at a variety of sites, to be honest. Like, I look at Sana, which is a Syrian state media, mainly for updates on what's happened. Like yesterday or the day before, Damascus was shelled and more people were killed. But the media is not going to talk about that. Or if they do, they'll say it was probably the Syrian government that shelled its own people.
Right there in the heart of Damascus, right?
Exactly. And that is another, I have to say, Lise Doucet, BBC. In April, my first visit to Syria, there was a school that was shelled, and one child was killed and 60 were injured. And I went to a hospital with some others to see, document some of these injured kids. And Lise Doucet was there. And a woman named Mother Agnes Mariam basically challenged Lee's and said, are you going to tell the truth? Are you going to tell the truth that this school was mortared by rebels, by terrorists? And Lee's just kind of nodded her head. Her report later said, locals say or claim something like this, but it's known that or it's believed that rebels say the Syrian government shells its own people. And I, at the time, had spoken with somebody who was a soldier there, and I asked about mortars and trajectory. They explained, the size of the mortar. If you actually ask these questions, you can find out from where the mortar has come and who has fired it. And it wasn't the Syrian government. So it's just, one example. And I never finished, but the Al-Quds Hospital I saw in June, and it's still standing. So it was a complete lie that it was reduced to rubble.
Just another on the long list of lies, I suppose. All right, well, I guess that brings us up to the present day, because the impression that people get when following this casually is that it's basically just a cleaning up operation now in Syria. The Syrian civil war, quote unquote, the terrorist insurgency is almost over, but there's shelling going on in Damascus. Tell us, what is the actual situation right now? Eastern Ghouta is still occupied by terrorists, Jaish al-Islam, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist factions. And if you remember Jaish al-Islam, their former leader, Zahran al-Lush, had liked to put civilians in cages and use them as human shields. This is the moderate rebel that's still occupying Eastern Ghouta, and these are the areas where mortars are coming from and hitting Damascus. They were doing that last year it was lighter, but there were still mortars falling on Damascus, and they still every now and then happen. I don't know, as you know, I'm without internet most of the time these days, but I don't know the latest on-the-ground military advances. But basically, Deir ez-Zor, which is a major city in Syria's east, has been fully liberated, which is a momentous thing because it was surrounded by ISIS. And you would think, since ISIS is the boogeyman in our media, you would think that our media would be cheering for the fact that ISIS has been defeated in Deir ez-Zor. And all these people who've been besieged for years can now live their lives. But maybe you can explain whether or not our media is reporting on this. I highly doubt it. But there's something of note, too, with this area, Deir ez-Zor. Last year in September, the U.S.-led coalition for almost 1 hour attacked a Syrian military position in the mountains, Tharda Mountains, near Deir ez-Zor. And, because it was prolonged almost 1 hour, they cannot claim that it was a one-off accident. It was an attack that they knew very well they were attacking a Syrian position, killing, I've seen numbers from 60-something to up to 100 Syrian soldiers. And immediately ISIS took over, and the U.S.-led coalition did nothing to stop them, just as they did nothing to stop ISIS as they were traversing hundreds of kilometers of open desert to take over Palmyra. So anyway, in terms of developments, Deir ez-Zor is liberated. I don't know what the Syrian army has done in terms of Eastern Ghouta, but I do know that the same old starvation propaganda is coming out in the media around Ghouta. And just yesterday, I think it was, Walid on Twitter, I think you might know him, I can't think of his Twitter handle, but at Walid, noted that there's now 2 new Banas, Bana Alabeds, in Ghouta. And they're saying, we want to document our daily lives here on Twitter. And then without, pausing for breath, they went on to say some nonsense scripted kind of rhetoric. Yeah. Well, if it works once, why not do it 1,000 times? Well, yeah. And that's exactly why we need to confront these lies in the first place, so that they can't keep using the same trick over and over and over and over, which is why it's so important that people like yourself are actually doing this investigative work. You've been in Gaza, covering that, obviously. You've been, obviously, in Syria for the last couple of years. Now, what's next on the itinerary, or is that a state secret?
Well, I have no state, really, affiliations.
Stateless secret.
Yeah, more like that. No, I don't have any plans, really. I'm working on writing right now. I will go back to Syria at some point. I haven't decided when. I was in North Korea at the end of August, just to get just a taste of North Korea. Is it as crazy as the media says? And it's not. No country is perfect, but all this hype around North Korea. It was very interesting to be there and talk with people there. So I'm just going to be working on more writing. I started up Patreon. I thought that over the years I've met many amazing people like yourself, and it would be interesting to turn it around and interview some of these people, and share with people who follow me, share some of the voices of some of the people I've met over the years. So,
well, I would, for one, would be extremely interested in that. So tell people the Patreon address.
It should be Eva K. Bartlett. It's all pretty new to me, so it's on my Facebook. I know you're not on Facebook. Good for you. It is linked on Facebook, and I can certainly send you the link to put in show notes if you'd like.
Yes, we'll definitely do that. We'll also direct people, of course, to your website, ingaza.wordpress.com. And we'll put in a few of the articles that you've written over the last several months about Syria, talking about some of the issues that we've touched on today. If you want my advice, I think Iran might be a good place to be thinking about reporting on next if you're looking for hotspots. But at any rate... maybe we'll leave that to someone else. All right.
I'd love to go to Iran, and if I do, I'll certainly let you know.
Please do. Yes. It would be good to have some good English voices out there on that issue as well. All right, Eva, I think we'll leave it there for today, but I hope we can have you back on for updates in the future. And I'm very much looking forward if you do have some interviews and videos and podcasts and other things in the future. I would definitely be interested in that. So we'll keep our eye open for that and let the audience know when it's out. Eva K. Bartlett, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank you very much, James.
Available now from CorbettReport.com. Oil. The 19th century was transformed by it. The 20th century was shaped by it. And the 21st century is moving beyond it. But who gave birth to the oil industry? And what are they planning to do with that power in a post-carbon world?
To an oil fortune join the divestment drive.
There is a price to carbon in their future.
The negative impact of population growth.
That is important not only for the planet, it is important for the business.
What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population.
How and why big oil conquered the world. Watch the documentary for free or purchase a DVD copy at CorbettReport.com/bigoil.